Beth Noy, and I'm a designer with the Urban Design Center. The UDC is pleased to host today's UDC talk, Tailored Infrastructure, Opportunities in Raleigh. Our two speakers are emerging leaders in Raleigh, and through activism and research are bringing new ways of looking at our urban environment. First up for this dynamic duo will be Jedediah Gant. Jedediah Gant is a digital urbanist living in downtown Raleigh. Jed comes from a design background, receiving a Bachelor of Architecture from UNC Charlotte in 2003. Afterwards, he moved to London to work for the Dutch firm Erik van Egert Architects. After working on design projects in Russia, the Netherlands, Spain, and England, he moved to Raleigh to work for Clearscapes, an art and architectural firm based in downtown. Jed is the co-founder of the Raleigh-based news site, New Raleigh. The brand has continued to grow and move from standard news articles to opinion, urban strategy, and community conversations. Some other urban-based projects started by Jed include the Cook Street Carnival Community Street Festival and the Raleigh Murals Project. Serving as a member of the Raleigh Appearance Commission for the past 5 years, Jed has helped give advice for upcoming urban projects in Raleigh. He is interested in the intersection of technology and communities, developing his master's new media thesis on how Raleigh could use design thinking to create a hybrid media infrastructure to improve and increase urban engagement by citizens. Closing out the lecture today will be Sarah Queen, an assistant professor in the School of Architecture at the College of Design at NC State. Sarah received her Bachelor of Environmental Design and Architecture from NC State and her Master's in Architecture from the Graduate School of Design from Harvard University. She has worked with Frank Harmon Architect as a lead designer and project manager on award-winning projects across the Southeast, and currently is a project manager at Joe Sam Queen Architect, which is based in Western North Carolina. At the College of Design, Sarah teaches undergraduate and graduate design studios, as well as urban-focused research seminars on infrastructure systems and mapping. Her ongoing research investigates infrastructural networks through mapping methodologies and visual strategies with the goal of facilitating deeper, more diverse understandings of urban systems and the processes which shape physical place, cultural space, and social territory. Please welcome Jed and Sarah.
Well, Sarah and I, we were communicating already about how to combine some of the things we were working on. And so we decided to, because my project has a lot of infrastructural components, and the projects that she's been working on with her studio also kind of start to talk about how we define infrastructure and how we, what we expect from infrastructure in our cities. We decided it would be a really good idea to just kind of bring both of these concepts together and present them as one. So I'll talk a little bit, I'll introduce my project, and then I'll pass it off to Sarah to talk a little bit about some other projects. So what you see here is something we created together, but we often think about infrastructure as from the top down and from kind of an aerial view, and we see it as these kind of high efficient systems. And we're interested in kind of questioning that, and that the fact that systems which are not resilient to change are precisely, they have been designed for narrow uses. And so what we hope to talk about here is integrated systems and how we can kind of think about systems in a new way. So this is kind of just a collage that we created to kind of talk about this idea of systems and what they mean and where do you view systems. And so here what you see is like integrated systems. So on the left you see we talk a lot about transit, biking, and pedestrian activity, and we have all of these different like light rail, railroad, bus rails, and we often think about them as separate pieces. Yet that's kind of an outdated system, and there's a lot of discussions in the city about how we move infrastructure forward in a way that's a little bit more like this, where we start to overlap things and each system can kind of play off of the next. And we purposely do that to make kind of social spaces. We do it for opportunities, for new economies, and the idea that when you bring something together, something that's unplanned, and unplanned programs can kind of come together and we get new ideas out of those. So what you see here is the Olympic Sculpture Park in Seattle, and over on the left there basically were several different systems, several different infrastructural systems that were in place here. And what the architecture landscape company of Weissman Freddie did was try to figure out ways to kind of programmatically overlap each one of those systems. And they took the challenge of bridging these kind of different active transportation lines and create new publicly programmed spaces. And we think this is a really good example of taking something that was kind of pretty desolate and kind of in a way confused, and kind of infuse it with new energy and new concepts, whether it's greenscape or landscape to highways and rail lines, kind of all put together in the urban fabric. And so we think in Raleigh there's lots of ways to approach infrastructure, and so what we'll talk about here today is a handful of student projects from NC State College of Design, most of which Sarah has ran the studio for the past few years, but most of these come from this year. And these projects offer alternative approaches to infrastructure in the urban setting, and we'll go through some ideas of bottom-up, multi-scalar, multifunctional networks, adaptable, and network ecologies. We think that with Raleigh experiencing all the growth that it's experiencing right now, that some of these ideas, whether it's through energy or media or other things, can be integrated into these new media or these new infrastructure approaches. So the first one is called a bottom-up system, meaning that it's component scale, and I mean it's built from the bottom up, and it's not, they come from a predetermined catalog, but they also allow for pieces to happen kind of not sporadically, but in different locations, and are brought together underneath a larger umbrella. And that means they're not conceived as a finished network or an entire system, but that they can add up together, and that these systems are flexible. So the first, we'll talk a little bit about that through my project, which was called Citizen Informed, and it's all about the idea of hypermedia infrastructure. And so hybrid media infrastructure, what hybrid media is basically when you think about a collage and you bring together all the different layers of Photoshop or any other kind of system, even the old kinds of collage of kind of adding things on top of each other and getting a final solution. So hybrid media is the same thing. So what you see on screen is when you're watching a commercial and you see infographics over top of filmed video, what you're seeing is lots of layers that have been brought together, and the hybridity of it is brought together in one place. So my project kind of discussed Raleigh as in a similar way of how can we take Raleigh from ground up and layer concepts of media over top of it. And so what I did was I created 4 different pieces or kind of systems on top of the system. And the first is a zone, corridor, direct, and direct connection in a spot. And I'll walk through each one of these. But each one has it's a distinct type of interaction and content. And so the type of information that moves through these is relative to each one of them, but they can all come together, as you'll see in just a minute, to kind of create new connections. So the first is a zone. And basically a zone it's invisible. It's something we already kind of see in our urban environment. It's blanketing technologies a lot like Wi-Fi networks. So you could go places, and if you look at your phone, you kind of get pop-up saying, you're in this zone, you're in this zone. What if as a government we started talking a little bit more about that, and as a city, and started implementing these zones a little bit more thoroughly? And so something like Fayetteville Street could become its own zone, and you're starting to, when you go through those, you get information saying, you're on welcome to the City of Raleigh, City Hall is this way. And so from a civic engagement perspective, you start to become informed through your phone and through your device, and you know that you're in zone 1 or whatever, and you can become a little bit more informed about your urban setting, as well as somewhere like NC State could have its own zone as well. So you start, which NC State does, but how can we figure out ways that those zones themselves could connect to each other? Could have faster network speeds and more blanketed technologies inside of those, and they could also share connections. So each one of these buildings, which is currently a similar situation in NC State, can have their own Wi-Fi networks where they start to talk to each other and start to send information out to the user. So the second is the concept of a corridor, and what a corridor is it's exactly the definition of a corridor. It's a long kind of strand, like a formal street structure. And the idea of taking technology, and rather than the zone being a little bit more kind of ubiquitous, this could be more directed. So you were walking down a particular street or corridor, and there is embedded technology along that. And So these would be major thoroughfares, like in downtown Raleigh, again, using Fayetteville Street as an example, but taking existing infrastructure that we already have, like light poles, walk signals, and various other poles, and basically wrapping them with technology and a layer of infrastructure, a layer of media that could then start talking to the pedestrian, the user. So someone that's from out of town can start to get information from these. There's Apple's working on similar concept of this with their beacons, and some other companies are also starting to create kind of sensor technology that starts to talk to phones. So say basically from the naked eye you couldn't see this, but the technology itself would be invisible, and it would help. Say you're walking by the Urban Design Center and you get a ping that says lecture inside. Right now we have that kind of disconnect. We consider ourselves an extremely smart city, yet we have very little ways that our government speaks to our citizens through civic engagement. And so I think things like this could really help with communication, as well as some like high pedestrian areas like Hillsborough Street. How can we then layer information and media over those through going out on a sci-fi limb and here and saying, the crosswalks, the light poles, and people could start. It makes these areas potentially more active because everyone's on their smartphones all the time now, but we could also educate them through this system as well. And to me, they could communicate with the urban environment a little bit more. Right now, we kind of look at our phone and not at the people around. Well, what if our phones in our city start to ping us to say, look up? What if one of these poles said, look up when you walk by it? Things like that. As well, there's potential incentives. So you walk by somewhere like Arrow, which is just a few blocks from here, and you get a ping that says you get a free beer with your haircut, which is already a system, but it's a way of advertising as well. So the third aspect of this, from this bottom-up kind of piece technology or piece infrastructure, is the direct connect. And so what the direct connect is it's a straightforward connection between two places, and those places are in distant locations, but they share technology. So in my mind, there's ways that we could kind of get businesses or organizations together to start speaking to each other, and when they're separated through geography. So somewhere like CAM, which currently is a very beautiful place, but what if we took the screen of it, or the exterior glass of it, and turned it into screens, and you could actually see what's happening inside the NCMA from CAM, and vice versa. What if you're at the NCMA and all of a sudden it's kind of, just for one night only or something, an iconic kind of structure is kind of turned into a screen that you can see into there. It starts to really rethink what museums are. It starts to rethink what media is and how we can kind of interact with our museums. So you're kind of walking in, and maybe you're at NCMA and you're like, wow, there was this event at CAM that I couldn't go to. Yeah, you could actually see it from NCMA. As well as places like Hunt Library, which is a very high digital or high media kind of zone. What if the idea of the connection between D.H. Hill on NC State's one campus and Hunt Library could have a kind of digital connection for students, so they can see what's happening inside the other library while they're on a separate campus. And finally, from an urban civic engagement, what if somewhere like City Plaza or Market Exchange Plaza had screens that were showing construction cameras that going on? What if city council chambers meetings were projected out in public? What if you could see what was going on in North Hills, and so on and so on? You could kind of see out into the kind of periphery of our city. What's going on in the suburbs from downtown, or vice versa? What if you were in North Hills and could see what was happening in City Plaza? But if you could see a hopscotch main stage, but you're in a plaza in North Hills. So the last is called a spot, which is exactly what it says. It's just little spots around the city that are kind of singular technology, and they're spread out. They have different sizes, and they start to rethink what public space is relative to media infrastructure. So what if our bus stops were smarter? What if our infrastructure could start telling the history of the area, so you have some type of interactive maps? What if you knew when the bus was coming by just standing at the bus stops? It's not a new idea. Tons of cities have this. It's everywhere in places like London, Yet here, you have to stand at a damn bus station and say, what's the number I call? I got to call this number, or I get on an app. That's really tough. So what if our bus stations were smarter? What if we took this level of media infrastructure and overlapped it to create, things? What if they had Wi-Fi? What if they were, were really smarter and they could tell the history? And what if you could interact with those things? What if we had digital pavilions in our park like Dick's? You know, we're about to work on Dick's. How are we going to think about media infrastructure, or just infrastructure in general at those locations? What about the R line? What if it had its own Wi-Fi? TTA has its own Wi-Fi. What if the exterior of the bus also had live streams of things? What if you could see what was happening in your city from inside of your bus? And finally, then, taking that idea of bottom-up infrastructure and then starting to overlap all of these. What happens when you start to overlap the corridor, the zone, the direct connect? You start to get new connections. You start to get new zones where CAM, you start to see this direct connect. Oh, you can see out there what's going on in CMA. CAM has its own Wi-Fi. You've got this corridor with things speaking to you. But yeah, you can come into this and start to become educated from a citizen, from a civic engagement standpoint. What if we took existing infrastructure and we started overlapping a corridor on the poles, but then we started integrating direct connections from here out to other places? You could have a Wi-Fi zone where people could go up there and hang out. And so what happens is all of these things start to overlap as an infrastructure and create a new 21st century kind of view of the city, as well as something like City Plaza, which is doing a good job, but it could do a better job. What if these color poles, whatever they're called, had media embedded on them, and they had a different type of Wi-Fi, they had a different type of interaction. We had a digital pavilion in there, and then when you came in, the city started speaking to you and telling you what your opportunities are around you. So what I presented today is Dick's downtown, and various downtown have opportunities for a network like this, but I think it's kind of exponentially available. We can start having direct connects between downtown and RTP. We could have Olmsted to Dick's. You know, we could have NC State campuses, all the universities our hospitals start connecting and things like that. So that's the end of what I'm here to present, and Sarah's going to walk you through a few more concepts relative to these overlapping networks.
All right, so Jed started us off with looking at the delivery of media infrastructures and trying to think about how that utility could be thought of to open up and benefit public space. So I'm going to show you 4 more projects and 4 more ideas that start to do the same. So in relationship to bottom-up infrastructure is the idea of multi-scalar infrastructure. And traditional infrastructures already work this way. When we look at it at a system, it has a certain set of responsibilities and functions, but then when we look at it as it hits the site, it might have additional responsibilities that are not at the same resolution as the larger system. So to think about this, I'm going to show you Meredith Smith's project. Oops. We have 2 computers working on 2 different systems. So Meredith Smith's project, she looked at the idea of connecting 2 infrastructural systems which are coming to Raleigh or the Triangle region. We have the rail system, whether it'll be light rail or heavy rail, and then we have Google Fiber. And she thought about combining these 2 systems that are partially public and private funding so they each synergistically build on one another. So as Google Fiber comes in, Google Fiber needs to have fiber huts surrounded around the area, scattered around the area. And she thought, what if these were in the locations where we're planning our future light rail stops? Because right now, many of the studies that look at the light rail system have predicted that some of the locations will have low ridership. So what if the fiber line and those huts were located in places, spurred economic development around them, and so then there was a density that built up that could sustain the ridership that the light rail eventually needed. So to do this, she started looking at the whole system. So she started looking at the rail that's running from Durham all the way through Raleigh, and started to think about how each of these stations could have a economic function in them and could be incentivized to have certain clusters, agglomerations. So for her, one way to think about that was that each one had a type of program that they engaged. So rather than RTP's campus, where they have, or RTP, which is a collection of a lot of campuses, she thought, what if we scattered out that economic development model? And so each station became a cluster with a certain set of economic emphasis. So the one that's up near Duke's medical campus might have an infectious disease and and medical focus, whereas the one in central Durham that's near the underground might have a startup focus. And so you would be capitalizing on what's in the surrounding environment to start to think about how you would make economic development around those locations. So I'm going to walk you through her proposal for West Raleigh, which is a station on West Raleigh, which is located about halfway between NC State's campus and downtown Cary. And she looked at a few of the nearby partners that she thought might come in and redevelop this site with Google Fiber and the city as they're developing their rail lines. EPA, NC State, and SAS are nearby. And she thought that this would be a good location for the clean tech cluster. So she began by looking at the structures, the urban structures, the park structures that are surrounding this site, and started to think about how at the site scale, this station would have to have responsibilities that are not evident at the system scale, that it would have a specificity as it hit the ground here in this place. She thought about how actually the proposed commuter rail station is right here, which is right off of I-40, and there's an office park development already there. She proposed shifting that one station to the east so that it engaged more with the residential neighborhood, and also took advantage of the arena parking lot that is empty about 90% of its life as a park and ride station with buses, so that we wouldn't have to have parking on this site for a commuter rail, but instead you could utilize infrastructure that's already there. So she thought about the phasing of this site. So again, like the whole system, you would begin by installing these Google Fiber huts, and aligned with those would be co-working office pods. And she thought that these would be types of entrepreneurial infrastructure that would be across the region. So here are her office pods, which she designed as a modular unit that would be transported on the train. And then depending on the site for that future station location, they would have different arrangements. And each of these would become the scaffolding for the future development and the future station. As of now, they would just be co-work stations that would be aligned with Google Fiber, but they would be designed for multiple potential futures going forward. So if we go back to West Raleigh, in the second phase, after we have the office pods, and so there's a buzz and there's an activity already on the site, if that took off and more people were willing to invest in this site, which is not yet a rail station, but going to be in a few years, she thought that maybe you could begin to add additional social program that the community could use. So a grocery, a market, spaces that would support the co-working, like a larger conference center, or more permanent office spaces. And then over time, adding at this particular location, because she was interested in connecting to the Blue Ridge Corridor, the Greenway, and the Art Museum to the north, she thought about offering a library or a museum space on top of it. So now the light rail station or the commuter rail station is not just a station that people pass through every day, but it starts to be a destination for the city and for the neighborhood around it. So she's taken two systems that are in isolation, which is the Google Fiber and the rail system, which hopefully will both be coming in, especially sort of the rail, and used one to be catalytic to the transformation of the landscape so that the other one is more successful. The third idea that we're going to talk about today is multifunctional. So traditionally, infrastructural systems have been defined or designed for one single function, and they do that one function very well. So they deliver water very well, especially in the era that they were designed for. But as the city grows, as they're asked to do other things, they're not as flexible as we might like them to be. So if we begin to conceive our systems as multifunctional, they might have more resilience as we move forward. So to explore this idea, we're going to look at Christian Aiken's thesis project. And he noticed, as he was looking around sort of the North Carolina landscape, that we have declining diversity in our crops. But we have actually, he was calling them farms, but we have data farms. We have a lot of server farms that are going up in rural North Carolina because of our relatively low energy costs and our relatively low property values in rural areas, but the location where we are on the East Coast in our growing population. So we see Facebook, American Express, Google, Time Warner, all these people are building these fairly large data centers across the state. This is happening now. And so they are really large. They're about 3 city blocks in terms of their area. And they use a ton of energy to cool themselves because they have a lot of machines in them that are producing lots of heat. So he said, could we think of this as a resource, this heat as a resource, rather than as a problem we're trying to solve and that we're pouring a ton of energy into? So this is the scale of a typical data center to the scale of the city. Those are the same scale. So you see that it's about 3 city blocks. And he said, well, what if we take the model of building the data center as one unified piece and distribute it as an energy source in downtown buildings. So we're allowing development in existing buildings or in new buildings to use the waste of one system in order to fuel another system. So he applied that for his thesis project to a multifamily housing development in Raleigh, which we're seeing going up everywhere over the last decade. And he thought about how, as typical sort of multifamily housing and mixed-use development, the bottom is commercial. He thought that might be a market coupled with greenhouses, so there's urban food production in downtown. But really the energy that is needed to supply multifamily housing in terms of heating and cooling and electricity would be produced by the server located in the basement at the core of the building. So through heat exchangers and heat recovery systems, you could take that energy that's already being produced that usually we're pouring more energy into cooling to now transfer that and fuel the building. For him, he has a real interest in urban farming and food production, so that was another program that he overlaid in this housing infrastructure. And you start to see sort of the public spaces becoming a productive space for growing and a sort of social space, which we see at Raleigh City Farm, which has been a lovely addition to see come up in our city. So at the end of the day, for Christian, he was trying to maintain the function of 2 systems that we have, or 3 or 4 systems that we have: food production, housing, and sort of the data farm, the locating and the machines that serve our cloud that we work on so much, and using the waste from each system to fuel the other system. So there's a piggybacking and a synergy within those. The next system is adaptability, and I would say that many of these projects have attributes of multiple ones of these principles that we're outlining. But for adaptability, one of the ways that we see adaptability happening quite a bit in architecture is sort of adaptive reuse. But that's a singular, it's taking one use, changing it to another use. There's not a cyclical or dynamic adaptability necessarily built into that model. And if we could start to think about what are the changes that our physical environment needs to accommodate, and how are those changes shifting over time? Do they shift over the course of the day? Do they shift over the course of the week, the year? Do they shift over market trends? Do they shift over ecological trends? Then we start to think about the requirements of our program differently as designers. So for this project, Dylan M. Pink looked at storage units, which are a pretty mundane logistical landscape that, while they're highly designed in terms of being efficient for their use, they're not designed in terms of how they hit the ground and integrate with the urban fabric around them. But they are an infrastructure that support our commercial activities as a culture. In America, each American has 7 square feet of off-site storage. It's a lot of off-site storage, each of us. If we average it out, so somebody's got a lot of it, because I don't have any of it. But these are ubiquitous across the country. And if you look at Wake County and you look at the demographic data of where wealth is, so this is property values, so the darker gray are the highest property values to the white, which are the lowest. You see that storage units are sort of everywhere. They're both in high value site locations and in low-value site locations. But the way that they're developed, they're not necessarily developed to stay there for a long time. Often they do stay there for a long time, but it's not necessarily how they're intended when they're built. They are cheaply built. Their rent structure is a monthly rent structure, and they're often used as a land banking strategy by the property owner and the developer to get a little bit of money out until they can really redevelop that land for more permanent use. So he started to think about, how could we rethink this? Self-storage isn't going anywhere. We love to hate it, but it's not going anywhere. So how could we incorporate it, and how could we think about the resiliency that it gives a property owner or a developer, because it's a constant source of income, to couple it with other types of uses. So he ultimately chose housing and different housing types to look at, which I'll show you one of. He thought about, what if it was a monastery? You know, monasteries typically have a little cottage industry. They're growing mushrooms or doing something. What if it was self-storage that they were making money on to sustain themselves? What if a prison was above self-storage, and then self-storage subsidized that public infrastructure of a prison? Student housing, all the way up to high-end housing. So what we're going to look at is a mixture of high-end housing and student housing. He chose ultimately the self-storage unit that's right off of Hillsborough. That's Applebee's across from Meredith College. It's kind of an odd place for self-storage in that, I mean, it's a predictable place for self-storage, but this area of Hillsborough Street is getting a lot of reinvestment, and so that may not be there that much longer. You see, in terms of just the fabric, you have residential neighborhoods bordering each side. There will be a future rail line stop nearby, so that this site will be very accessible across sort of the urban region. And then we have NC State and Meredith University also adjacent to it. So there's quite a few users that you could predict. Despite its prime location that they like to talk about, it really doesn't engage its environment at all, purposefully so, right? You don't want a lot of people walking through the self-storage and breaking in or doing all sorts of stuff down in those alleys that you don't want. So they usually have sort of a fortress around them. So he was trying to think about how you could keep their function as self-storage, but start to add another program over them that engages the urban environment in a different way. So at the end of the day, he proposed adding to this specific site 16 3 to 4 bedroom units overlaid over the public, or the public storage, or the off-site storage. So down below here, you see the existing storage cells, and you see these housing units which puncture them. So if we blow that section up, this is the storage highlighted in yellow, and the units are above. So he's maintained the road that allows you to access your unit, and that's still contained by a gate. It's still sort of, for the logistical reasons that it currently works the way it is, that's maintained. But he's added this public layer on the top of that. That becomes our new urban street. It connects to the rail line, it connects to Gorman Street, it connects back to Hillsborough Street and Meredith. And so you have this new public service that allows that site to be part of the public realm of the city. And then above, he introduced roof gardens and balconies so that there were exterior spaces for the resident. But what's really interesting is that to go back to this slide, each unit has 3 storage units below it, and then it has other storage units that would be rented out as they are now to anybody who just wanted an 8 by 10 storage unit. And either the tenants or the owners of these units, for those 3 units below them, they could choose to use that storage themselves as their garage or for their own things, or as their family needs and family size shifts and changes, they could rent them out to other tenants. They could rent them out as a working studio, an office to someone else. So there's flexibility both for the developer and for the tenant over the course of their life. And ultimately it takes a place that is sort of a nowhere land that's quarantined from the rest of the city and starts to make it an active space for the public and the residents to interact. And one last project and one last term. So the last term we're going to talk about is networked ecologies. So for networked ecologies, we are going to look at Taylor Belger's project. He was really interested in the overlap of the economic ecology of trucking and distribution and warehouse networks. And then he was interested in the ecological networks of habitat corridors and urban sort of habitat in the city. And when you overlap those, the road network often bisects really important habitat that we have in our area. And so everything gets run over and squashed, or water filtration can't pass through the highway. And so you very quickly degrade very important ecological functions for our region. So he zoomed into, as he overlaid these systems, he identified moments where there was a lot of conflict between these two and said, I want to zoom in there, I want to see how through architecture and through rethinking these two systems, I can find an opportunity to make both better. So he ultimately chose, this is I-40, Lake Crabtree, this is Umstead Park, the airport is right up here, and he chose this sort of nexus where all these things are colliding. We have two creeks that are coming in that are very important in terms of taking the water from Umstead and filtering it down into Lake Crabtree, which now are run through very small culverts that don't support the aquatic life needed. He looked at also the recreational uses. We have a lot of biking trails on both sides of the highway. They can cross over on the one bridge, but there's not a lot of synergy of the recreation that happens on one side to the other side. And so how can we start to repair the ecological functions with an activity that happens in relationship to this road? So this project is called Amazon Forest because he leveraged the idea that Amazon might be an investor in this project in his mind. So he proposed, to back up a minute, how many of you are Amazon Prime users? All right, about half of us. So to get our package in the next day delivery requires a pretty intense infrastructure to make that happen. So just-in-time delivery requires quite a few warehouses that are distributed within a few hours of where everyone lives so that things can come in and out in a seamless way. So he took that idea of a just-in-time Amazon warehouse and used that as saddlebags on each side of the highway. So we see this in section, to build up and berm a potential new woodland that crosses over I-40. So this begins to find a solution for the woodland habitat, but not for the wetland habitat. So he proposed rebuilding chunks of I-40 so that they are bridges and allow the creeks to flow and connect Umstead over to Lake Crabtree rather than the culverts that are maybe 8 feet tall. So the road, which historically way back in the day might have been 4 or 5 lanes, which is now 8 lanes with a huge concrete barrier and very large swales on each side, which is almost impossible for anything to connect, now becomes connected at the base for the water, but at the top for both humans and animals to move across. And the scale of these warehouses is pretty large. And when you look at ecological corridors, you realize that the scale at which a little teeny salamander needs to productively move back and forth across a highway is actually much larger than this. It's thousands of feet to make a productive wetland that actually can move back and forth. So the scale of his project here is about 1,500 feet from one side to the other in this direction. And so by sort of leveraging the large scale that Amazon would need for its warehouse and locating it on 40, halfway between 95 and 85, right adjacent to an international airport, it's ideal location for Amazon if they could find enough space for a warehouse. So it's an ideal location for them. And using a program that's allied with the transportation network, you start to bridge the ecological networks that are damaged because of that road network. Another really fun aspect that Taylor thought of, Taylor's a pretty creative guy, we're hearing about all these drones and drone delivery with Amazon, so that there are not a lot of trucks coming in and out of this facility. He thought that the local distribution could happen with drones, so that in his sort of overall design, he designed these large courtyards, which would provide outdoor space for the few people that are working within the warehouse, but it would also allow a place for these drones to come in and take off with the packages. So we designed this nice little screen system that the drones live on at night, and here you see them flying around with the packages as they go and leave for delivery. So he had fun with that, he did. At the end of the day, two views, driving on the road, in and through the system, or on Lake Crabtree, kayaking, and potentially continuing up into one of those creeks up to Umstead. So, in closing, Jed and I wanted to present sort of a wide range of projects that make us think differently about how we approach infrastructural systems. In the past, we've asked infrastructural systems to provide the stocks and flows of energy, water, food, media, in order to sustain us, but we haven't asked anything else of them. And these projects hopefully are helping us think about a way that infrastructure can also help sustain the cultural and social aspects of our city that's drawing everyone to Raleigh. So, to recap, in our opinion, tailored infrastructure is bottom up, so it's not conceived of as an entire system. Instead, it's conceived of strategies that can grow as is needed for the city. It's conceived of as multi-scalar, so as we look at the whole city or we look at the urban triangle region, we understand certain functions of the system, but as we zoom into the site, we also expect that it functions at a site scale, that it facilitates human occupation at the site scale, which almost no infrastructural system does currently. We think that it should be multifunctional, so traditional infrastructures have been designed from the standpoint of being very energy efficient or very efficient and monofunctional, and they are hyper-tailored for that one specific use, but they don't allow for multiple uses. We think that should be challenged. They should be adaptable in order to allow our city to be more resilient as it grows and changes. And they should be networked. They should be overlaid with one another, and they should understand how they interface with the things that are coexisting with them. And to end, we think it's our responsibility to start to push these changes, both as citizens and designers and planners in Raleigh.
All right, well, thank you so much.